I was going to record a video this week, but instead I decided to get the flu, which in retrospect was a bad idea. So instead, I'm going to do something I've never done before, and that is read my D&D books. I don't know if this is this might be a terrible idea. I might never upload this video, but this is my collection of D&D books. See, I do. You know, I've some respect for D&D. Even though I complain about it all the time, but I've not read them. I'm gonna have it a crack. I'm gonna have a crack at reading these books and seeing if they're actually good or if I've just watched a lot of Critical Role. Players Handbook is the book that you need, really. You've got to have the Dungeon Master's got to have a copy, but ideally the player's got to have at least one copy that they can share, because I use it a lot as reference material. Like, it's got all of the details about how the races and the classes work. It's got references for equipment and combat. But and most importantly, it's got the spells. The spells list is a big chunk of the book, and it's very hard to play without that, because the rules are so detailed on how spells work. Although occasionally I'm still a bit fuzzy, but so it's hard. It's hard to play. I don't think you could play without this book. Whereas like a game like Fate, which is my favourite game, you maybe the GM just needs a copy of the book, and that's it. That's all they need. A copy of the main rule book. You don't need any supplements. You don't need anything else. You don't even necessarily need the rule book. Once you know the rules, you don't need to bring the rule book with you to every session, because it doesn't really contain anything that you need to reference. So even then, after a few sessions, you don't need to refer to the book. You don't even need to bring anything at all to the game sessions in terms of merchandise, which obviously is a problem as a company trying to sell stuff. That's awkward. Like, you just buy the book. What if one person out of 6 buys a single book and then never buys anything else, and then doesn't even really use that book, and maybe lends that book or sells it second hand? Then you've not got a good business model. Whereas D&D has got a bit more of a racket to it, not necessarily a bad way, but sometimes in quite a bad way. That it knows it wants to sell stuff. It wants to keep the hobby alive with money, I guess. So it's created a game that's complex enough that you need to be buying these books, and also it's got like this big world lore. Like I said, the big stack of books that I had a minute ago. The other book that I probably reference the most is probably the Monster Manual, even though I tend to custom build my monsters, but I tend to base them on something. And it's got a lot of reference points for like how various powers and things might work. So it's good reference material. Even though I homebrew a lot, it's a good reference material, the Monster Manual. The one that I have never read is the Dungeon Master's Guide. I have genuinely never read the Dungeon Master's Guide, or even much of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I've looked occasionally at the items, like the magical items section, but my players will tell you that I tend to homebrew those as well, and I don't necessarily need to reference anything for them. So I've maybe read a couple of pages of this book in total over the years, and I've been running D&D for the last, I don't know, 9-10 years, and I've been running RPGs for well over 20 years, and I used to teach D&D at a board game cafe in Wood Green in North London, and I've run like learners games and things like that. So I've never read this. So I'm going to look through this. I'm not going to just record myself entirely reading. I'm just going to sit here, read the book out loud, the entire book. That would be a very strange and probably very boring video. But I'm going to give it a read, and we'll go through some highlights. If you wanted me to live stream just reading the book, if I tell you what, this video gets 10,000 likes, which is a somewhat unobtainable goal at this stage, then I'll just live stream reading the books. Because why not? Someone might find that interesting. Let's start with the beginning. It's got a preface. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a realm called the Midwestern United States. They think they're funny. Okay, well, this is really, really, really a self-aggrandizing kind of introduction. They're like, yeah, D&D's amazing. I mean, it did start something. It's not worthy of praise. To play D&D and to play it well, you don't need to read all the rules, memorise every detail of the game, or master the fine art of rolling funny-looking dice. None of those things have any bearing on what's happening about the game. That is true in the sense that it's true for the RPG hobby as a whole. You don't need to it's very flexible. D&D is one of the least flexible systems in the RPG hobby. But as a rule for the whole, you don't need to know like every little thing about the game you're playing. What you need are two things. The first being friends with whom you can share the game. Playing games with friends is a lot of fun, but D&D does something more than entertain. Playing D&D is exercise in collaborative creation. This is actually a pretty good intro. Second thing you need is you need a lively imagination, or more importantly, the willingness to use all the imagination you have. Oh my god, I died. So I think one of the reasons I personally think that D&D is a good gateway game, because it is complex in its own way, but it's so dense with lore and design that you don't really have to put that much creative thought into it. You can just manipulate what it's got to do the creative things you would like to do. So you don't have to be too creative. So you don't have to like come every session to the table with your A game. You've got enough building blocks in here. It's the same logic on which Lego sets sell. Like if you want to, if you buy a Millennium Falcon set, you can build the Millennium Falcon. But if someone just gave you a big massive drum full of Lego blocks, you probably could still build a Millennium Falcon, but you wouldn't really know where to start, and that's more stressful than having the instructions and the correct pieces. So that's kind of what D&D is. It's an instruction manual with all the correct pieces that then says here's how you play, and then other games are a bit more like here's a big box of Lego, just do whatever. I personally prefer the big box of Lego do whatever approach. But I can understand why this is easier, and I get why this is easier. People that say that D&D is easier in that respect. It's hard in the denseness of the rules respect, but it's an easy game to play because it's so laid out, because it's so meticulous. In my opinion, I think people that say otherwise are kind of being a bit silly. I think looser games are harder to play sometimes because they demand a lot more of the players. Countless writers, artists and other creators can trace their beginnings to a few pages of D&D notes, a handful of dice and a kitchen table. Well, D&D is really convinced that it has shaped modern culture, doesn't it? It's really like changed the world, D&D did. Mr. Mike Merles in May 2014 clearly thought very highly of D&D. There's a lot here and I haven't even gotten to. This is all stuff it's all early stuff. It's all stuff that I've genuinely never read. I watched. I either played with people who already knew the rules, or I watched actual play shows and been like, just picked up the basics. But I've never really read any of this. I actually think this is fairly well structured so far. It's giving a good overview of the game. It's not overwhelming too much. It's explaining all the elements that you need to know in an order that you would need to know them. I quite like the 3 pillars of adventure, and I think the D&D. I like how much it talks about structure, because I think that's D&D's strength is its structure, and it's rigid and it's kind of contained. D&D. It's not really about, or it is about imagination, but it's less about imagination than other games. It's more about finding creative use of the rules and the structure of the world, and I think that's one of D&D's strengths. And people that don't lean into that are playing D&D wrong. Essentially, if I apologise, but you can play these games wrong. You absolutely can, and it's foolish to say otherwise. But now we're on creating a character. And this is the section I have read, because obviously I've made characters, and this is kind of the first part of doing that. And I think I might have actually read this section in full at some point, because it does look fairly familiar. The races, I don't really have a preference along the races. I think they're interesting. I don't think they vary enough. I think that there is room for it to matter more. I think once you get down into D&D, it's so rules tight that it filters out a lot of things. Like, it doesn't matter necessarily that halflings are kind of just like half the size of everybody else, or that Dragonborn have got scales and things, and or like the tiefling can have a tail. None of these things really feel like they play much of a part in the game itself. Just mechanically speaking, you can flavour it to do stuff, and it's not that there aren't mechanics. There are things for it, but it always feels like everyone just feels a bit like generic. Like there are a few. You get a few stat boosts and maybe a little ability here or there, but they don't feel like they I don't feel like they vary enough, maybe, for is what I'm saying. I would almost certainly pick my class first, because that's the interesting part, really. And then I'll just either pick a race that complements that, or a race that like seems like it would be interesting with that. Like I played a Goliath wizard once, because that seemed like an interesting combo. Like obviously the Goliath doesn't complement with the wizard class, but it seemed like it could be interesting if I was a Goliath who took up wizardry, and everyone was like, "Oh, it was stupid Goliath." I don't think any of the races should have dark vision. I think dark vision is such a stupid ability. For one, I think like 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5 sometimes of my party got it, and at which point I just like, fuck it, everyone just, there is no darkness, everyone can just see whatever, I don't care. It's too, I'm not keeping track of who can see, and there are spells that can fix it, and you can just light a torch. It's just like like when I make dynamic maps on Roll20, I program in everyone's like how far everyone can see. That's super fun. I think that's a really interesting way of playing. So I have like darkness maps, and then I program their tokens so that each player can only see what their character can see, or the distance their character can see. So I do that. But when you're theatre of the minding it, or you're playing at home, it's just too complicated to worry about that nonsense. So personally, I just think that no character classes should have dark vision, or there should be just universal rules for it. I think it's more interesting if you can cast a spell or do something that needs to create light. It's just that's just more interesting. Dark vision is dumb. It's one of those rules, and D&D has a few of these that only works if the players police it. So if you like say a space is dark, and the players that know they have dark vision behave normally, but the players that don't have dark vision deliberately hinder themselves. It's like incumbents. I think incumbents is the same way. It's kind of a dumb rule, but but it only works if the players police it themselves. Players have to actively hinder themselves if they are unable to do the thing. And the problem with D&D is that it's such a power fantasy that players don't want to hinder themselves. Other systems are a bit more encouraging of players to be like, you don't have to be the most powerful person in the universe. Whereas D&D is like, I've got to be amazing and awesome, and I want to do all this cool shit, which is hard to do if you have to like hold yourself back in some way. But it is one of the, I think dark vision, incumbents, there's probably a few other rules I'm not thinking of right now. They are rules that only work if the players themselves are deliberately kind of making use of them. As a dungeon master, I'm just like, I don't care. I'm not going to bother to police it, because it's just not worth my time. It's going to take up too much brain space. Now on classes, the fun stuff. My first character was a monk, because I hadn't played D&D before, and it was playing in there was a Critical Role chat group that I joined way back in the early days of Critical Role, and we formed like a bunch of D&D groups from it, and I joined a D&D group of like 8 or 9 players. It was kind of a ridiculous number of players, but it was my first real experience of D&D. So I did a BuzzFeed quiz of what D&D character should you play or class and stuff, and I got a human monk on my BuzzFeed quiz, which now that I know more about D&D, feels like it's just generic person. A little bit, which is an odd one. But human monk was my first character, because that's what a BuzzFeed quiz told me to do, and I played that, and I really enjoyed it. But I played an experimental monk class that I think, as far as I know, has never been released. It was a healing monk. It was a monk who had like a paladin has a healing pool, and they, as part of their flurry of blows, they could like open palm tap an ally and heal them as instead of using one of their attacks, one of their 2 flurry of blows attacks, which is a really good ability. It's really useful. I could just sort of like run in, just like bam, 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 just like heal some people. And I had some healing magics, and I had some other abilities as well. I think I could cast Sanctuary for free, or like as something like that. But yeah, there was some really, it was a really neat little set of abilities. It was a little bit broken in the sense that you could heal yourself. So basically I had triple the number of hit points, or double the number of hit points that I actually had, because I could continually, every turn, if I wanted to flurry of blows, I could heal myself until I ran out of key points, of course. But I could heal myself back up to full, basically, at any point I liked. Path of Tranquility, maybe? I don't know. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was a really good game. It was really sprawling and really kind of well structured. Shout out to Edwin, who was our DM for that. And I believe everyone in that game met via that chat room or via that server or Facebook group or whatever it was for Critical Role, and we all just kind of like just met there and kind of started playing this game together, and it just kind of really fell together. It went on for quite a long time. It went on longer than I think I left at some point, but it was still going. But yeah, it was that was a really good game. But I have since seen that people say that monks are bad. Monks and rangers. Rangers are more obviously bad, just from reading them. But I don't quite understand the hate necessarily. I think the problem is with monks and rangers is that they're superfluous because the fighter class exists, and the fighter class can do a lot of things that they can do anyway, and also do more interesting things. Also, I think part of the issue is that a lot of D&D players can't really be bothered to play D&D, and the power imbalance means that a lot of the really useful things that say monks and rangers can do become unuseful because people can't be bothered to do them. People can't be bothered to run survival or run like scrappy combat. It's just generally kind of metagame assumed that your players always have their armor on, and they always have their weapons, and they always have access to their spell components. But if you play, and if they don't have to like worry about terrain when they're traveling across the land, or where they're going to set camp, or how they're going to hunt for food, or how they're going to track the enemy. Things like that. They don't do all these things that like the monk and the ranger are really good at doing. People don't bother to include in their games because they can't. They don't want to. They want to do the power fantasy thing, and they want to like be casting massive spells and fighting giant monsters and things. They don't want to have to do the scrappier side of it. Whereas in the logical sense, a character that can fight with their hands, fight anything just with their hands, so they can do magical damage with their hands, and they can do a decent amount of damage, and they can get lots of attacks in. That character is way more powerful than everybody else, because everybody else has to like spend 10 minutes putting their plate mail on, or if they if their weapon breaks, or if they lose their weapon, or if they something that they haven't got, if they haven't got their spell components, some characters are completely useless. So a lot of smaller details that would make the other characters useless makes monks and rangers super useful, but nobody wants to roleplay those bits. Nobody wants to be like, oh, well, you've been attacked by bandits in the night. Sorry, you don't have your armor on. Oh, your weapons are over there. You've got to take an entire round to get your weapons and grab them, and you still won't have your armor on anyway. Whereas the monk is like, well, I'm up. I've got my natural armor class. I've got to punch a man's head off. The ranger as well, they've got their skills. If you have to track your enemy, if you have to find a good place to make camp, if you have to negotiate certain terrains and things. But again, these are things that are just hand waved in the meta logic of the game, because the players playing the other classes don't want to hinder themselves. It comes back to my dark vision thing. The players don't want to hinder themselves by being like, oh, well, I wouldn't have my armor on for dinner. So the fact that we've been, tricked by the host of this dinner party, and now we're in a fight, means, well, I haven't got my armor on, I've just got a fancy suit on, and I haven't got my spell components with me, because why would I carry them? I left them in my room upstairs. So players aren't going to hinder themselves in that way. They're going to be like, no, I've got all my stuff, I'm good to go, I'm the most powerful person in the room. Whilst which ultimately detracts from classes like the monk and the ranger, like I'm saying, who have got these more specific abilities. So monk and ranger are bad character classes in the sense of how people run D&D, not necessarily in the mechanical usage of them. They have a lot of mechanical usage, but in the sense of how people run D&D, they just very quickly become kind of useless characters, at least compared to like alternatives like the rogue and the fighter, who can do what they can do but better. Personality and background. Now, I've said in videos before that I think that the popularity of actual play shows has absolutely contributed to the rise of D&D. Has really highlighted that what people want is rich story, and they want these character. People do want to play a character with an interesting background, interesting personality. They don't necessarily want to go full actor, on it. But they do want a story, and they want a story that and I don't think people realise how much players contribute to that story, particularly in something like Critical Role. The players contribute a lot to that story. It's not all on the DM, it's not all on Matt. The players contribute so much. I think a lot of D&D players don't realise that they have to put the work in if they want that flavour. If you don't want that flavour, if you're an old school D&D, then that's fine. Skip this section, whatever. Just use it to get like a little bonus or whatever it is, because it's just as doable for that. You can just use it just to get like some extra languages or some extra like little ability or something. Or alignment. I'm going to read the alignment chart. It's just dumb. The whole thing is dumb. Alignment is a dumb concept. It's bad, and you shouldn't use it. And I can't think of a logical reason to use it or defend it in any way, shape or form. Just have characters who act that way, that's fine, and if you want to define it you can, but it's just pointless. Your characters just have motivations, and how they will behave is just is what it is. It doesn't need like this strict kind of categorization. I don't know why alignment exists particularly. It doesn't give any bonuses or any mechanical usage. It's weirdly, in the past and even now to some degree, it's sort of racist when applied to intelligent monsters who have like a fixed alignment. It's just kind of silly. Alignment is bad, and you really shouldn't be using it because it doesn't serve any purpose. I know there's some elements that like whether you're good or evil matters. Maybe you like magical equipment or certain spells or things, it will actually have a mechanical effect. But I feel like it's kind of, I feel like you could very easily ignore it and not even notice it serves no real purpose. The backgrounds thing in here is sort of, it's a good starting place, especially if you're not feel like writing an elaborate backstory. You've got charts for everything, and you can just kind of have a kind of vague idea, and you can build a character off of that. It depends how deep you want to go in backstories. I like my players to write backstories that I can then build the game around, and I will build a lot of my game around players' backstories. As either of my groups will tell you, their games are almost entirely built around the backstories that they gave me, and I've taken them in directions they didn't necessarily think they were going to go or expect them to go, and tried to surprise them. But yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. It's basic, and you can it's a good starting place. And everyone's got to start somewhere. So if you start from here, and then you can work on building your character's backstory from that, and you can use these as prompts to build your story from. In the same way that Fate does that, builds off of each other's story elements. I don't have much to say about Chapter 5 equipment. It's just pretty utilitarian. It just is what it is. It just is very efficient system. You can pick stuff. One thing I don't quite. So this is a slight thing I have about D&D. I don't really understand what the point of having a wide range of weapons that do different damages is, because you're going to pick something for flavour, so you're like, well, I want to be armed with a dagger, or I want like a belt of daggers, say for example, and then it doesn't really matter, or you're going to just pick something that does the most damage because you want to do the most damage, and I don't quite know what there's not enough that makes the weapons special, that makes picking it like a mechanical consideration. So I kind of feel like it should just be flavour, the weapon that you have, and it does make it can make a little bit of a difference. But I think that the damage you do should be the damage dice you roll really should be based on your character's strength, because that's a big hitter. Like I think a weapon can do certain things. Like I like the idea if it's two-handed or it's versatile or whatever, it has reach and things like that. All those abilities are attached to weapons, but really it should be your strength that determines the dice you roll, I think. I just think that's a more interesting way of doing it, and it gives strength a bigger purpose. Maybe you could use your dexterity as to roll your dice, as what dice you roll for damage for like ranged weapons, but that's just me. It just seems like a more logical way, instead of like having this weird table of just sort of random dice that each weapon rolls. Well, at a certain point, it doesn't really matter because it's just there's not that much difference between the dice. Really, this is a D8 and a D10 is not that huge, unless you're rolling like a bunch of them. Quite extensive, this, isn't it? So it's not bad. I just don't think I've ever really used much of it or thought about much about it. And I don't know who has. Do people go through these? People look up what a magnifying glass. Something like, I better buy a magnifying glass. Lens looks nice. Lighting a fire with magnifying glass requires light as bright as sunlight focused in. So there's rules for how to light a fire with a magnifying glass. Has anybody ever used those rules? Yeah, I just feel like this section is full of a lot of rules that I expect most people ignore. Again, if you're a player, this is for the players to police themselves. So the players will be like, oh well, I've got this kit, so I can do this. I think that's fine. But yeah, other than that, it's just a lot of rules that I expect nobody knows, and that even the people that know it don't really use it. How is this? Trinkets. When you're a character, you can roll once on the trinkets table to gain a trinket. I have never done this. I didn't even know there was a trinkets table. This is news to me. It's a mummified goblin hand at 0, a metal urn containing the ashes of a hero at 100. So just a random thing. Yeah, it's just a big list of random things. Your character can have all of the 100 and your character can have a random thing. I'm not quite sure what the point of that is. I mean, I guess it's flavour. Sure. Why not? Trinket table. Didn't know that existed. A diary with 7 missing pages. Some of these are kind of interesting, like story prompts. I might do this. I might write a short story. I might just roll the D100 on this trinket chart and write a short story about whatever it is that I get. This is a useful reference section. Customization options. And it's just reference for everything. Feats. Right, we're at the feats. Feats are great. Everyone loves a feat. That's FEAT. Not everyone loves feet. That's disturbing. Oh my god, I've only just made it to part 2. Part 2, playing the game. Good lord. This is the thing. This is useful, but it's the thing that I will find that players argue about. So this is using each ability. So the little section is using each ability, and it tells you what you would roll. So what would you roll your strength is? So what you'd roll an athletics check to do, or other strength checks. What you make dexterity checks for. It's got the rules for encumbrance and lifting and carrying. Again, lifting, carrying, encumbrance, rules that no one bothers to think about, I'm sure. Very rare that it comes up, or people just like ignore it or just like hand wave it. It's, again, if you want to police it, it's something that players should police themselves. Players should say, I'm not strong, my character's not strong enough to do this, or whatever. Or I can't carry all this stuff. That's for the players. I'm not, as the GM or DM, I'm not gonna bother policing that. That's on you. Chapter 8, Adventuring. This is about how you run the game. Whether adventures are exploring a dusty dungeon or a complex relationship of a royal court, the game follows a natural rhythm, as outlined in the book's introduction. Number 1, the DM describes the environment. Number 2, the players describe what they want to do. And number 3, the DM narrates the results of their actions. That's fine. I think some of the systems I prefer, number 3 is a bit more on the players, so narrating the results of your actions is a bit more on the players. Players tend to know if they've passed or failed, and then they get to determine the specifics of that themselves. Because something that hinders D&D, I think, is because it's a relatively complex mechanically game. Player characters are quite complex, and the DM can't be expected to know everything about all the players. They can't know what all the players' stats are, all their abilities are, all their spells are. They just can't know these things. It's just ridiculous to expect them to. And even in like looser games like Fate, the players that maybe only have a few things, a handful of things that make them unique, mechanically speaking, but I still can't be expected to remember all of them all the time. So it's on the players to police themselves, and that's about the players. And this is something that they do on these big attributes like Critical Role and Dimension 20. What the players are really good at is dictating their own failure, whereas I think that most D&D players are bad at that, because they're playing a power fantasy. They want to succeed. They want to be Superman. They don't want to have to fail, but you've got to get good at dictating your own failure. If your character is bad at something, do it badly, or do something wrong on purpose. If you know you've been asked to do something and you know you're going to fail, or if you roll the dice and you fail, dictate your own failure. Lean into your failures. Failures are fine. It's fine. Failures are character building. But I don't think it's. But I still think it's. I still think it hinders a lot of people and a lot of games. Because there's no advantage in D&D. Failure is just failure in D&D. Failure in D&D can get you killed, because the game is so fragile, and your characters are so fragile. Whereas in a game like Fate, for example, character death is extremely rare, because you can take larger consequences. You can lose control of the plot. You can lose elements about your character. Character can be eliminated in other ways. So character death is pretty rare. So you go like, well, so failure doesn't destroy the game, whereas in D&D, failure can destroy the game. Failure can utterly destroy the game. It can end up being your character death, or like a big bad doing something like that, world ending and things like that. So because the stakes are so much higher, at least in that sense, the players are reluctant to, the margin for error is very small, and it creates it means that the game loses this narrative. It loses its dynamic narrative, which is a big failing of D&D. A big failing of D&D is its lack of narrative structure, because people want to play in this kind of big Lord of the Rings-esque games. I know it's the meme of everyone thinks their game's going to be Lord of the Rings, but it always ends up being Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But people still want to play in those kind of big, like, cinematic moments, and it's very hard to get those in D&D, because you are either winning or you're losing. And that's not really how, a cinematic moment is you're losing, and then suddenly you win. That's what makes it kind of cinematic. Is overcoming that adversity, whereas in D&D you have to be like constantly winning, otherwise things can go very bad very quickly. And Critical Role fakes it, and I'm 100% sure that Matt fudges a lot more than people realise in Critical Role. And the players lean into it, and the players are very happy to lean into these things. But but the Critical Role really, they fudge it so that they can create those kinds of moments. But even then, if the players are doing nothing but getting beaten down by a villain, then they're gonna lose. They're gonna die. It's like, if the villain massively overpowers them that much, there's nothing they can do about it. You don't suddenly come back. The underdog doesn't suddenly come back in D&D. It's not mechanically not how the game works. I got a bit of a tangent there, but that's just kind of one of the issues of D&D. But this is the way it's structured here. The DM narrates the results of your actions. That works better, because then they can manipulate the game to everything falls in line, essentially. Oh, there's rules for how much food you need. How many days you can go without. I didn't actually know that was in there. Rules for the number of days you can go without food. 3 plus his or her constitution modifier. That's how many days you can go without food. Minimum of 1. Everyone can go 1 day without food. That's cool. I did not know that was in there. Again, it's at a certain point of high level D&D, which both my games are kind of in now. You just sort of hand wave that. It's like, I'm sure you can find food. I'm sure you bought food with you. I'm sure you whatever. The minutiae, the survival element of the game gets lost very quickly. Even though I think it's interesting, it'd be interesting to play a hardcore survival mode D&D, where players have got to account for all their food and where they sleep, and all their spell components that will run out and things like that. I think that would be a really interesting way to play D&D, but you'd have to have everybody on board, and it would have to be a fairly regular game. I think the problem is that when games become irregular, or they become like once every few months, because you just struggle to put groups together, you don't want to get bogged down in that kind of nonsense. You want to get to the fight. You want to get to the big exciting moment. You don't want to spend an entire session worrying about where you're going to get your next bout of rations from if you're then not going to play for 6 months. That's just going to kind of just be annoying. But I do think it'd be very interesting to play a hardcore survival mode D&D with a low level group. If you're interested in doing that, message me in the comments and maybe I could run that game for you. Combat, right, now, so this section I haven't really read before. I pretty much have learnt combat by either playing in D&D games other people ran, or by watching Critical Role and just assumed that they were doing it correctly. The other problem, of course, is that combat is a very separate game in D&D, and I've said this before, but it doesn't like tie into the other narrative elements of the game on any level. Like, there's no real logic to combat in D&D. It's just a series of mechanics, and I learnt this when I ran my first D&D game, and one of my players went to the trouble of moving around the battlefield to get behind the enemy, and then they were like, I stabbed him in the back, and I was like, okay, and I kind of flicked through the book. I was like, that's not really a thing. Like, you can't really stab someone. He wasn't a rogue or anything, so like there are no, you don't get behind people. It's not a thing. Like, your position on the battlefield doesn't matter. You can't like be that strategic about it. Even though he left the building and climbed around and gone through a window to get behind them, and I gave him advantage just, I think, because it's like, well, you should have something. But mechanically, the game doesn't account for that. Mechanically, the game is pieces on a chessboard moving about, doing what they're going to do, and there's no kind of thematic or narrative logic to combat at all, which is fine. I grew up playing Warhammer. That was kind of my start in the gaming hobby. I'm okay with, minis on a map combat, and I play a lot of board games which are all obviously very mechanical in nature, but it just feels like it loses something. D&D feels like it loses something during combat. It loses its role playing, and it just becomes this little board game that takes way too long, and often doesn't matter. But the annoying thing is that I do actually think the rules are pretty solid. Like, I think D&D combat runs pretty well. It's so disconnected from the rest of the game that when we suddenly have to do it, I'm like, well, this is kind of annoying now. I was into that other bit, and I can get into D&D combat. Like I say, I think it works pretty well, and I think there's enough interesting elements to it that you could run a really interesting kind of minis combat. But you are playing a miniatures war game. You are running miniatures combat. You are running a board game, essentially. You're not role playing. It's not. Sorry, everyone that keeps saying, "Oh, it's all role." It's not all role play. You're playing. You're playing a war game, which again is fine, and I think it does it well. Like I say, I can't say that enough. I think the rules are generally pretty good, and D&D is a fun war game, but it is a war game. It's just not role playing. It's strange. It's strange to me. It creates a disconnect in my mind when I suddenly have to switch from roleplay into the wargaming. And I like both elements, and you can feed into the roleplay into the wargame combat. But it gets, if you do it too much, if you feed too much roleplay elements into the combat, then it starts to muddy up the rules. And at a certain point, like, well, can I just do anything? Like, no, you can't just do anything, because that defeats the point of the game that you are playing. You've got rules that you've got to work to your advantage. If you can just do anything, then it's the old rocks fall, everyone dies argument of the DM. Just goes, okay, well, if everyone can do everything, then why? And the DM's deliberately hindering themselves so that the players can do whatever they want. It's just not that interesting. You're just kind of like letting the players beat you up at that point. And the DM's got to be having fun. It's not enough for the players just to be having fun. The DM wants to be creative. So if they're not obeying the rules, then it's more fun for you not to obey the rules. But if everyone's obeying the rules, then that's its own thing. But again, it's not a role playing game. I don't know. It's just I don't necessarily have like the mental capacity to go into this any more than I already have in previous videos. But it's just an odd thing to me. It's just a weird mess. It's where the game really disconnects for me. Spells. I won't go into too much detail about this. This is a fairly solid section, and it's pretty much mostly just spell list. It's a good quarter of the book, isn't it? The spell list. I am a little bit more, and I would suggest this, but I try to be a little bit more tight on like the verbal, somatic, and material elements of spells. Like, I always check what they are. And I think, well, can the character definitely do those? And I think that the So if your character's hands aren't free, they can't do the somatic elements. If they're, say, underwater, they can't do verbal components, because you need to be able to hear. It's an element of not just like moving your mouth, it's an element of being able to speak the words and then those words be heard by this kind of the ether, essentially, the magical elements. And if you've got to have access to your material components, if you need material components, I think people should be tighter on that. I think people should be should dictate more. And you could go really far to say that if the wizard's holding a weapon, they can't do somatic components. You could or get material components out if their hands are full. You could go really hardcore on that. I don't go that hardcore, but I do try to be a little bit more restrictive. Sometimes I'll give disadvantage. So if I've ever given you if you're playing one of my games, if I've ever given you disadvantage on a spell and you're not sure why, it's probably because I considered that one of the components of the spells was hard for you to do, was hard for you to get to. I maybe didn't explain myself well enough, but that's often it. And I think that casting spells should be trickier. I think you should absolutely embrace that. It should be a trickier thing to do. If you need your hands free, you need to be able to speak out loud. You need to be able to get access to your material components. It's a fiddly thing to do. It's not just an instant thought, unless you're a character that can instantly kind of like create a spell without doing any of those things. But if you've got to do those things, you've got to be able in a position to do those things. It's that much of the book. That's just spells. You almost need this book just for that, just because that much of the book is just a spell. It's got to be a quarter, maybe even a third of the book. Look at it. Just spells. It's great stuff, but that's kind of the main reason I think that maybe you need this book. I skipped over it, but short and long resting is again kind of a dumb dynamic. It's just sort of silly and badly implemented. And again, a lot of people, I especially, probably just hand wave it like, yeah, you were able to get a long rest, whatever. We need to take multiple long rests, as long as they're not doing it mid combat. And if they do it in a dungeon, then that's time for the dungeon to reset or the enemies to get better prepared. So if they're doing it like in the middle of something important, I either won't allow it, or it'll make everything worse. Like everything else has that extra time to prepare or escalate to some degree. And I'm not above interrupting rests, the players' rests, if they're doing it in an unsafe environment. But again, like if there is any downtime, I'm often happy to be like, yeah, you got a long rest, whatever. It doesn't matter if you had time to sleep or whatever. If you've had like X amount of time, if there's like a chunky gap of you doing essentially nothing, fine, it counts as a long rest. I'm just skipping through all the deities at this point. I'm not going to read those either. Although it is interesting that they've included a variety of options, not just their own. So the deities thing is awkward. I don't think it works very well from a narrative standpoint. The concept of having good or evil gods who are capable of acting on the world in some way doesn't make sense. It just sort of it creates a lot of questions that don't really work. Like it's super awkward if you think too much in Critical Role. Spoilers for Critical Role Season 1, but it's super awkward if you think too much about Vax's deal with the Raven Queen, because it doesn't make any sense, and it's narratively quite bad and ugly, and it just and within the context of D&D it doesn't work. There's so many mechanical ways around it. It doesn't make sense that a god would care enough to like hinder somebody like that, or like impact the world that much without doing something more useful. It's just the concept of good and evil. And Matt's got the kind of the divine gate thing going on, where it's like, yeah, the gods can't do so much, but they still can, and it's awkward to have this concept of a benevolent god who but then doesn't bother to do anything. It highlights a lot of like awkwardness in religion. I think D&D, when you have actively gods, like why isn't everyone in D&D, why would not everyone in D&D worship something, and why wouldn't everybody just worship the most powerful thing, because they know for sure that the gods exist. 100% the gods definitely exist, and they are there, and they can grant you powers. So like, yeah, just why wouldn't you do that? Why would there be any debate whatsoever? And it creates an awkward dynamic. So I have my gods as more in my homebrew world as a more ambiguous kind of existence. There's a bit of a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy-esque design to them, in that they're kind of this weird bureaucratic organisation that has its own rules, doesn't really care about the material plane that much, or at least tends to ignore the material plane, and they've got their own thing going on, their own whole like world and worlds of issues and conflicts that they have to be more concerned about. They don't really, the people are just kind of like the little people. They're the 1% doing their own thing, whilst the material plane is the rest of the the population who are beneath them, but still quite powerful in their own right. But they are not infallible. And they're not there to do good or necessarily even evil. Like even my demons and my devils are not that intrinsically evil, because if they were, why wouldn't they just destroy stuff? Why wouldn't they just like cause chaos? So everyone's got their own agenda and their own thing going on. So I just play them as like they're basically just the same as the rest of the people, the rest of the players. They're just operating on a higher level. They're just level 1000, whilst the players are kind of capped at 20. We then finally have a really terrible index page, which is annoying. So for one, it's just not very well organised, the index page. But I really hate every now and then it says, so where are we? So we've got a reference or index. So you're looking something up. I look up casting time. So casting time, see under casting a spell. So I have to look up to casting a spell and find casting time there. And then we've got, if I want to look up climbing, see under movement. Okay, well, why do I have to look up a second thing? Would it not have been easier to just write the page number that I needed for climbing instead of writing see under movement? It's much, you only would have done presumably only 3 characters. But now I've got to look up movement and find climbing, and so page 190. Could you not just have written that? Just write that next to climbing instead of writing see under movement. I'm looking up climbing. Just write it. It's not. Why did you do this? Why are you making me look up a second thing when obviously I wanted to look up climbing? So I'm still gonna have to go to that same page number. You just directed me to a different way to find the same page number. Why? That really annoys me, because so frequently I look up something on this index page or on one of the other books and it says to look up something else. And I'm like, why? Why? That's so annoying. But yeah, that's a minor gripe. That's a minor design gripe for the next version of D&D. Cool. That was me reading the Players Handbook for the first time, because I'm sick and I don't know what else to do with my life. I hope that was interesting. It sparked some interesting talking points. If I tell you what, if this video hits 1,000 likes, I'll read the Dungeon Master's Guide, and do in a similar kind of way, because I might do that anyway, but I give me some likes, because I want likes. But I've genuinely never read this book. And I probably should read it fairly, in some. It would be quite interesting. Look how crisp it is and untouched. Look at how crisp the pages are. So yeah, so that actually might be quite interesting. But yeah, like and subscribe to my channel. If you're finding me for the first time from this video, then this is I hope that's been interesting. Just me in my sick adult state, just chilling out here, half alive, reading the Player's Handbook. I hope that was interesting. Do check out my other videos. I do some much more detailed D&D or role-playing based videos, and we've got some actual play stuff more coming out soon. I've done there's just stuff on this channel. Working on a mega game at the moment, The next one of that is on December 3rd. That's December 3rd, 2023. I'll put links to tickets in the thing below. If you want to play a mega game set in the Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos, it should be a lot of fun. That's happening in North London. So that's my big thing that I'm working on at the moment. If you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-Fi support page. Again, links below to all of my everythings. And thank you for watching. I promise I will be hopefully less sick next week. But yeah, that's me for now. The end.